think one of the things that was really remarkable about your article was that art doesn't have to be something that you like, right? It's that it's forcing you to have to deal with things or put them in perspective in a way that you don't in your ordinary life, because entertainment fits already the narrative and the model that you already believe, the things that you already understand about the world. And so art is like pushing you in another direction. And yeah, say more about the distinction between art and entertainment, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so I think that in order, like, what sorts of arguments do people respect? Well, frankly, they don't respect any argument from the humanities or philosophy, because those were precisely the arguments that were destroyed by people like Pierre Bourdieu, who was a sociologist, who argued that, the reason why rich people read literature is to distinguish themselves from poor people. So everything is just about power structures. And these power structures completely govern our lives, and like your tastes are just an expression of this. And that was such powerful acid against at the time, contemporary notions of like beauty, that it just ate through those in the academy. Whether or not it should, let's leave that aside. But to me, what sort of arguments do people respect? Well, they respect scientific ones, because frankly, Pierre Bourdieu can go make his little criticism, but if you've got a scientific response, then there's very little that one can argue against. So my question was, is there a scientific justification for an objective aesthetic spectrum? And especially when it comes to fictions, like stories, like TV shows, films, video games, books. And I think there probably is, because evolution invented fictions. It invented dreams. So for some reason, evolution has keyed in on this idea that every organism should be exposed to made up fantastical stories for a particular period of time every single day. So wait a minute, like that's so strange. Like why would evolution invent fictions, right? And so, that led me, by the way, I have a PhD in neuroscience, and that led me to thinking about, well, okay, so what are the contemporary scientific theories of why we dream? And maybe if you can come up with a good theory for why we dream, you can come up with a good theory for why we consume fictions and why we should or shouldn't consume various types of fictions. And so this is what that whole article, and then also, if people want to check out something called the overfitted brain hypothesis, which is its more scientific version or form. And in it, I'm just arguing that dreams effectively help organisms generalize by being a very out of distribution sample compared to the regular life. So organisms actually have a very boring life, and they're very much like when you're training an artificial neural network. If you show them too much of the same data, even if it's very relevant, they'll get too highly fixated on it and they'll learn it too well. And you can prevent this overfitting by feeding them basically hallucinatory stuff that looks very different from what they normally see and is very like sparse and so on. And I actually think that that's probably the reason for dreams, which is that organisms that learn have a tendency to learn too well and overfit to their daily lives, and then they can't generalize. And dreaming helps them do that. And so if you kind of, I'll kind of skip over all the various scientific reasons to think that this might be a good hypothesis and where it fits in. But if you buy that, then you get pretty close to something like an objective aesthetic spectrum, because you can say that, listen, if what you're giving me in terms of the fiction, right? If I think about it like an artificial dream, and I think about it in terms of the cognitive utility, very broadly, by the way, the sense of cognitive utility is being used here immensely broadly. You can even just think about it as good for me, right? Then I can say, well, listen, if your art is just all stereotypes, then it's doing the opposite of helping me generalize, right? It's forcing me to kind of overfit the world. Like if all I watch are Marvel movies, right, then I'm going to think about the world in terms of heroes and villains, right? And everyone's either a hero or they're a villain. Well, it turns out when you age, you realize that there actually are no heroes. First of all, there probably are no heroes, but there are definitely no villains, right? So like nobody thinks that they're the villain of the story. Everyone is operating under the assumption that they're the protagonist, not the antagonist, right? And the number of people who think I'm evil and I'm going to go do something evil is so vanishingly low that they almost don't even impact life. Like you don't even really ever meet them. But you do meet people who are evil, but it's only because of some circumstance and they're reacting to it or so on. So, you know, and so that's an example of, I think, a very simplistic example of this overfitting. But to me, it's very important to be able to have some sort of justification of an aesthetic spectrum, and also to feel good about the fictions that I put out in the world. Because what I don't want to do, and I think every writer should think about this, is I don't want to just contribute like another icon that's there that keeps people entertained, and that's all it does. And you're just like this blip in this supersensorium, and you weren't kind of giving your audience anything.
So in some ways, that means that if you're writing, you have to break the model in some way, right? Like you have to take what people think that they are going to expect, particularly if you're reading, right? You have to have characters that people can somehow inhabit or see and say, I recognize those as human beings. They're taking actions that are somewhat along the lines that I would, and then something has to happen, or the character has to make a decision that doesn't fit in your current paradigm.
Yeah, it's much easier to define the lower end of the aesthetic spectrum than it is to define the higher end, right? So, but all you need to do is define one end, because if you define one end, you get the other end for free, right? So this is, again, something that's kind of missed in traditional discussions of this, that are, again, this isn't to say that there aren't many other good reasons to consume fiction, both philosophically, like to experience William James' oceanic awe, right? Or just because you have some sort of cultural justification for why you're doing it, right? But those are always more open to attack than something that has some sort of scientific basis, because if it's got some sort of scientific basis, then it becomes very hard to kind of attack it using maybe standard techniques. I'm aware that I speak in terms of like attack and defense in terms of ideas, like I'm an analytic philosopher. That's a bad habit that I've picked up. But yeah, I do think that you have to think about that. Like in the Revelations, as you know, which is a novel of mine that just came out like 2 weeks ago. You know, there is a murder mystery, there is a romance, there are like these classic genre elements. But then at a certain point, it shifts, right? And you realize that you're like, maybe you're not even in the genre that you thought you were in, right? And that sort of thing was very important to me. And I'm not saying that all artists should do it, but some of that, the structure of that book came out directly of thinking a little bit about the overfitted brain hypothesis, thinking about like what it is that we want from what it is that a reader wants in art and from consuming fiction and so on. So, you know, you can't scientifically design a book. Like in the end, the writer has to kind of be the one who has final say over everything. The scientist part of me can't have final say over anything in a novel. But that's kind of one of the ways I think about it, as being very upstream of something.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.